that's what running allowed me to do over and over and over. I could get to that place where I was certain I couldn't go on. Then I would find a way to get beyond it.
I agree with you. I think we tend to think that rock bottom is a free fall. It's going to go forever, right? But it doesn't. The sun rises. Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together. Okay, Charlie Engle, welcome to the Commune podcast.
Thank you, brother.
What a treat. Given what I know about your life from reading your absolutely marvelous book, and sincerely just really enjoyed it. I know the story, but how the story is told is just, it's beautifully crafted. So
I mean, to be honest, that's the nicest thing you could possibly say to me. So you're starting off well, because I whatever other things I've done, I am proud of the book, and as a writer, I wanted to really make it special.
Yeah, it's my job. It's a wonderful job, is to prepare myself to talk to people. And sometimes that can be somewhat of a dismal chore or very data focused or whatever. But this was just, it was so enjoyable. I went on some wonderful hikes, and I was like, oh man, I was riveted. I was like, I'm going to do another loop. So I just, I can't encourage people enough to go and get the book. It's called Running Man. And it's been out for a couple of years, right? Yeah.
Very little to do with running, which is, I always remind people. Every once in a while, I get a note from somebody that actually says, hey, I bought this book, and I'm trying to train for a marathon. I'll write them back, and I'm like, look, there's 10 other books I can recommend for that, but you just picked the wrong one.
No, it's a narrative. It's and I will also say that Running Man is not just the name of the book, but it's a moniker that you were given under very unusual circumstances, let's say.
Indeed.
And we'll go there. And I suppose it was funny when I was reading some of the nicknames that other folks got, like Pick and Roll and Squirrel. I had a nickname. So I was an avid street ball player. And so I played basketball virtually every day for all of my 20s in New York City, in Brooklyn mostly. And, I had to scrap it out, as you can probably
Let's
imagine.
hear it. What was it?
Deadeye.
Oh, well, hey.
Because that was my thing. I didn't rebound. I didn't do much hard work, but I was a deadeye shooter.
Yeah.
And so
we're going to play horse at some point.
Okay.
Mine was a little less complimentary. Mine was black hole. Because basically when the ball came to me, it never went back out. I never met a shot I didn't like.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, gravity collapsed in on itself when you got the ball. But, we'll get to, I don't want to give away too much too quickly. And we'll get to how you got the nickname Running Man. But I will say you were an epic alcoholic and crack addict for a good chunk of your life. And first of all, I want to congratulate you, 30 years in recovery. This past July, right?
Exactly.
And I know you also have a big birthday coming up.
30 and 60, and I don't know what's going on here.
Well, the thing is, here's one thing you can feel really good about, is that, so we're at this biohacking conference, right? And Dave Asprey, who's kind of the guy here, it's his conference, he confidently claims that he's going to live to 180 years old. So I was thinking about it. I was like, you're only a third of the way through, Charlie. What are you going to do for the next 120 years?
Yes.
Then you can look back on that period of addiction, that was just this tiny little part of my life way back then.
Are you sure Dave doesn't mean, though, just frozen cells somewhere in it? Because is that life? I mean, technically, if you...
I think he's pretty convinced that he will be animated energy or animated information in some corporeal form until 180. Given It's funny. Given what I know about your life, it's both incredibly unlikely, but also makes total sense that you would be at a biohacking conference given everything that you've done to your physiology.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit for folks that might be learning about you for the first time. Can you scaffold this conversation a little bit of your biography?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, it's been such a journey. And I mean, I did grow up in a house where, my parents were 18, 19 years old, and my dad was actually playing basketball for Dean Smith at UNC on his freshman team, and very first team Dean Smith ever had at Carolina. And
Wow.
and my mom was this just wild hippie woman with nothing but tie-dye and crazy hair, and so it was a very adult world, and I was an only child, and so sports were not part of my life. Although the freedom of running, my favorite part of the book, in a way, of my own book, is a couple of the early chapters where I talk about being, running around in my pink underwear, because my mom, anything she ever washed, if there were any whites in it, they all turned pink. And so, she just wasn't a laundry person. And so, long hair halfway down my back and out running in a thunderstorm, in Durham. But I do actually remember that imprinted in me, that feeling of joy that you get when you're a kid and you're running and you're like barefooted and it's raining and it's summer and you don't care. And my mom was never the, come inside, it's raining, she's like, go do whatever you want. And so that was, that was part of my upbringing. And then, of course, the other piece of it was being surrounded by a lot of drugs and alcohol when I was young. And it was just ubiquitous in the house. I didn't realize that other houses weren't like that. Now, it wasn't, to my knowledge, it wasn't like needles. It was just a lot of weed and a lot of drinking. And my mom was a theater person, and there was a cast party in the house every night. And, and I had a couple of experiences, one of which is in the book, about there not being much in the fridge. Let's just put it that way. We were, I don't know if we were on welfare. I mean, we were for a little while, but I mean, they were college students, so it wasn't. And as a kid, you don't actually know that. Like you don't know how poor you are necessarily. But one night I'm walking around, there's a party going on, and there's nothing in the fridge, and so I pick up a couple of beers that are half full, and I drain those because I'm thirsty.
Right.
And it tasted terrible. And as I say in the book, that one act planted a flag in my brain, and kind of claimed that territory for its own. Alcohol, and I just knew that was going to be, a comfort for me down the road, and and then I just kind of went on with life, and of course, later on it came back in a big way.
Yeah, there's a beautiful section in the book when you talk about running on the train tracks. I think you guys had moved up to upstate New York.
Attica, New York. My mom was working in the prison. She was teaching acting and writing in Attica State Prison this is just a year after the riots in the early 70s.
Yeah. And you talk about, I think, running with the trains, right? And then all of a sudden you were pretty far away from home. But you exhibited early in life just some unbelievable aptitude for endurance, right? You kind of had a sense that there was something with your physiology that was different, right?
No, absolutely. I mean, it is, and I will say my grandfather was, an All-American in track. I never knew him. He died when I was a year old, and he was the track coach at Carolina for like 40 years. And so I did grow up also with a legacy of being told as a kid that, you're just like your grandfather. You're going to be a runner. And I liked that. I mean, that was a nice identity thing for me when I was young. And I did figure out very early that I wasn't the fastest, but no one could go farther than me pretty much from the very beginning. I mean, probably just because nobody wanted to. But for me, I liked that feeling of going far.
Right. Well, I suppose that is the ultimate human attribute, because we actually, as a species, are not the fastest, but we can actually sweat, right? So that's one of the reasons why we were successful as a species, is that we could actually outlast faster things and go 40, 50, 60 miles and then catch our prey. But
Totally.
Your prey was maybe a 40-ounce spear.
Yeah, well, mine was, I had no idea what mine was half the time, but I did just kind of know that I needed to go. Like that was actually,
Right.
from early on, I didn't want to be in front of the TV. I didn't want to be anywhere but outside and on the move. And that was just, I think it is just part of my DNA.
Yeah. And then your dad moved away pretty early on, right?
Yeah, they divorced when I was probably 2. So a lot of that time I just described was actually my stepfather was, in the picture, and Dad went in the Army and ended up in Germany. I mean, crazy. He got very lucky because he applied for defense language school and got German instead of Vietnamese or Chinese, because he was of the age pretty exactly that, all of his friends for the most part were ending up in Vietnam, and it was just luck of the draw for him that he didn't have to go there. But he was gone for 4, 5, 6 years out of my life at that point.
Yeah. So your abuse of alcohol and then subsequently cocaine and then into crack, it got progressively more severe. And kind of in retrospect, would you attribute your proclivity to addiction to some of the more trauma-inducing components of your early life, or have you unwoven that at all in your own mind?
You're asking me at a particularly interesting time, because I'm, as you mentioned a minute ago, I just passed my 30-year clean and sober anniversary, and my answer to that question 20 years ago, 25, 10 years ago, much different than it is today. And I pretty much had the pat answer because I didn't understand genetics and the role that plays, and it is an important role. I mean, I was a 4th generation addict alcoholic basically, and with both of my parents struggling with alcohol addiction, and so there was that part, and then there was the environmental piece of just, I don't know, the trauma of divorce, which I didn't see, I didn't understand as a child. I mean, what child does really? But I'm a strong-willed person. I just, was kind of a suck-it-up person, and I'm like, how did that harm me? I made the best of it, right? I'm like, I have 2 sets of parents. I've got grandparents. Like, Christmas is great. Like, I get more stuff. Yeah. I mean, and it wasn't until even these recent years when I recognized the patterns of how I adjusted as a child and young adult to my parents drinking. How you do when you're in a house that's the predominant thing, and the most powerful person in the house drinks too much. You take their temperature every single time you come in the house or they come in the house, and it's a terrible dance. So I think the answer to the question is I've really begun to dig more deeply and accept the fact, especially with my mother, who she passed a few years ago, and I was much closer to her than with my dad. But with her, I defended her like deeply. Anybody who wanted to say, your mom wasn't always a great mom, I'm like, you better watch it. I was not pleasant about that. And I've reached a point now through therapy, through other things, where I can accept the fact that my mom was less than a perfect mom and still be incredibly loving of her and who she was.
Right. And being able to be honest about where people are flawed, and at the same time having grace and forgiveness for them, and sort of saying like, well, she was just doing the best she possibly could given the circumstances that she was in. And I think we all, those of us who have complicated relationships with our parents, which are many of us, my parents split up when I was 13, and I had a younger brother, and I took a lot of responsibility for it. First I was like, well, I can save this, or, well, I'm okay, but nobody's going to hurt him. And, all of these kind of responsibilities that we thrust upon ourselves. And then, for me, I assigned a lot of blame, in this particular case, to my mom, and I punished her, and we stayed with my dad, and I was like, you're not going to see me, and you're not going to see my brother, and I'm going to punish you for making this decision. And it took me most of my adult life to come back around and realize, no, okay, she was doing what she thought was the best possible thing given the circumstances that she was in, and certainly she wasn't perfect, and neither was my dad, but you come to a place where, you have to find grace and forgiveness, even if it's just for yourself, because you don't want to, you can carry that ember of anger around, waiting for the right moment to throw it, but who's getting burned that whole time? Well, you are.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant thing to say, and it really is so true. And my feelings are very similar to that. And I mean, I have kids, two boys who are 30 and 27 now, and I managed to screw them up pretty good in a lot of ways, and they grew up. I mean, I was sober pretty much for their entire lives. I got sober when my first son was 2 months old, and that still didn't stop him from becoming an addict. It didn't stop me from, divorcing their mom and creating other havoc. It was just life. It was just life. I mean, we actually had about as good a divorce as two people could have. We love each other still to this day. We co-parented, and it was a very kind, I was the one that wanted it. And it wasn't until years later that, doesn't matter how amicable it was, it still did damage to my kids. It still hurt them and it put them in awkward positions, and it affected them emotionally, because it just does.
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit about Gabor Mate earlier, before we started recording earlier in the day. And he's opened my eyes a lot to trying to better understand the nature of addiction. So I kind of wanted to ask you these questions in light of just the brief conversation that we had this morning. Is addiction a choice?
At some point, yes. And this is the way I like to say it, and I'm not even sure if Gabor would agree with this. I'm sure he would have a much deeper view of it, but I can only speak for myself when I say, when I first went to rehab at 25 years old, it was still 5 years before I actually, kind of got it. Mm-hmm. I didn't, I stayed sober about 6 months. So by all accounts, that was, I'm using air quotes here, that was a failure, right? So, but it wasn't, because before then, and I mean this, like before then, I had dozens of experiences where I literally was in tears at the end of a binge, and I'd spent all the money and I'd done all the drugs, and I'm alone and I'm depressed and I want to die. And I would literally ask the question to the universe, or in my head, what do I do about this? How do I get out of this? Up until that point, I didn't feel like I had a choice. I never felt like I was making a choice. I felt like I was compelled to do the only thing that was going to relieve the pain I was in. Pain from what? I couldn't answer that question probably even today, But once I went there, to rehab, and I got 6 months under my belt, I mean, I was happy. I felt good, like I was working the steps. I had a sponsor, like all these things were kind of in place, and my life got a lot better. Yet, at 6 months, I still chose to It's sort of like I got it now.
Yeah.
I got this licked. And I made a conscious choice at that point to think that I could control it or that I now could find a handle on it. So, I mean, I know that's not with Gabor, that's not the question you asked is not exactly the one I answered. I do not believe, though, at the core that I had a choice. And that's not letting me off the hook. Right. It's just how I feel. Because I don't ever remember making a choice.
Right.
Like, it just was. Once I started drinking when I went to college, that 10-year stretch of time is like one long blur, and I don't ever recall making a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because I think alcoholism in particular gets framed in a number of different lights. So sometimes it gets framed within the parentheses of choice, and there's a lot of blame going on, especially from other family members of like, oh, we keep investing in Charlie and he keeps letting us down, and so there's that. Then I think there is a slightly more enlightened version of it, which is, well, no, alcoholism is actually a disease, and there is a genetic component to it, we touched on, and that is also certainly true. And then there is kind of another layer, which is that alcoholism or addiction is an expected or an unsurprising outcome that emerges from trauma-inducing events. And and this is sort of Gabor's framing a little bit, is if you think about a wound, so something happens, like if you think more literally, like, I cut my arm. Well, what can happen? Well, that wound can fester, and it can get infected, and you touch it, and oh God, you have a visceral reaction to it. But it also can scar, and that scar tissue is numb. And so if you have a wound that is psychological, either from neglect or abuse or from some form of environmental toxin or whatever it happens to be, and you don't dress it properly, you don't tend to it, so it scars over, and you become numb with that part of yourself. And it is that alienation from who you are that propels you to begin to look for things outside of yourself to feel good, for happiness, external agents. And now that could be alcohol, that could be gambling, that could be approval on Instagram. It could be a litany of things. Some things are more detrimental to health than not. But I'm curious, because when I examine the social landscape right now and I see these cresting rates of addiction, I'm like, these aren't people making choices per se. And sure, there's a disease component here that is probably genetic, but that this is somewhat of a logical outcome coming out of a society that is so toxic.
Yes, it's all of that. I mean, it's funny, you triggered something in me a second ago, too, that a friend of mine who I confided in a lot about, my mom and her relationships with my family, and she actually told me, she's like, you were lovingly neglected, and I thought it was a really elegant term because, again, my mom wasn't neglecting me so that whatever. It wasn't to harm me. She was a 20-something-year-old college student, writing plays and directing, and like she was in this life, and I was sort of the inconvenient, add-on. and she loved me. I mean, I never doubted my mom's love. My mom was the kind of person who, the myriad of really questionable ideas that I would bring to her. I mean, all the way up to the end, things like, some of my runs that I did and whatever else. She's always like, oh my God, God, that is an amazing idea, like no matter what it was. And she was always that person that I knew would give me that. And it was really important in my life. But I do think that, the trauma that I have is real. It's something that I haven't done a great job of dealing with because I've been very busy helping other people deal with theirs. And I've recognized in myself in recent years, not only in addiction recovery, but I think I told you earlier, my wife has been very sick for a few years. And so I'm caregiving for her while I'm also doing all this other stuff. And it's a really convenient way to really just sort of neglect your own stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah. I mean, giving is a superpower for you. Leading, inspiring people.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. And I mean, I heard another quote recently that I really liked because we can inspire other people. You can't motivate people. I mean, that was sort of the quote that came up, which I mostly believe that. Like motivation is sort of an internal thing. You're kind of either a generally motivated person or you're not, but anyone can be inspired. And it's through action. It's rarely through words. It is why when even with all, this conference has been amazing so far, this biohacking conference, but it's not my style to ever even cross that boundary of telling other people what they should do. It's uncomfortable for me. I'll tell them what I do.
Right.
And if whatever they can take from that, and if they have follow-up questions, or I can even spark them to have a further conversation with an expert, and that's a win to me. But I'm not comfortable because I don't know their genetics. I don't know, I don't know where they come from. I don't know their pain. I can tell them about mine, but I can't tell them about theirs.
Yeah. There's something that you wrote, and I want to just refer to my notes here because it struck me. That you said something along the lines of this, that drug addicts are numb. They're numb to their feelings. They don't actually have feelings, but they manufacture feelings with drugs. But those feelings are not authentic feelings. Can you unweave that a tiny bit?
Yeah, that's very deep of me to have said that. So
it is. I struck me.
Yeah,
anyways.
well, and it is. And I do make the joke. Those fans out there who are Dexter fans, if you watch that, that was sort of Dexter's thing. Is he mimicked feelings that he saw in others because he didn't really feel those things for himself. So to fit in, he would mimic, empathy or compassion or whatever it might be in a way. And I will say, there have been times in my life, and sometimes even still today, where I feel cut off from those deepest feelings that I would like to be in better touch with. And I don't really know. I don't really know why. I think it is. It's an addict thing. You can't necessarily talk yourself out of it through deep talk therapy. I recognize these things about the traumas that have happened. There's plenty of other stuff that have happened to me early in my life that aren't that dissimilar to other, kids that I think I've acknowledged them all to the best of my knowledge. And yet I still feel disconnected quite often from my own, I guess from the compassion I have for myself. Actually, I don't want to jump ahead in the story, but there was when I did this thing in the Sahara Desert years ago. Interesting, there was a cameraman who showed up in the middle of this big adventure that I was having, and I'm now like 45 days without a meeting or without anybody in support of me, and I'm kind of just a mess. I'm an asshole. I'm just not a particularly nice guy. Because I'm running 50 miles every day. I'm doing these hard things. And this cameraman, as it turns out, was a sober person. And he actually said to me, he said, Charlie, I've been watching you, and it seems like, and I didn't know he was sober at the time, but he says, it seems like you have great compassion and feelings for everyone else, but you have absolutely no compassion for yourself. And that struck me, and it's always stuck with me, and I think he was right.
Yeah, it's so interesting, because if I were to try to identify an arc to your story, it would be you coming to terms with real, authentic feelings and an ability to express and be honest about them. There's a section towards the end of the book where I think you're having one of the first or early conversations with your wife, who is now your wife. And it is such a moving part of the book and of your story, not just for the exchange of feelings and emotions that were happening in that particular scene, although that was also very emotional. But there was another layer where I was like, Charlie just would not have been able to have that conversation years before. And to me, that was like the arc of the book and of your story. And obviously, I don't know you well. We've just been in kind of three-dimensional space-time here and earlier today. But you are nothing if not an incredibly sensitive, vulnerable, feeling human being.
And actually I thank you for that, and I am, and so I know it probably sounds a bit confusing that I don't feel, even for myself, that I'm in touch with some of the deepest parts. I mean, some of it's because, like, right now my wife has been sick for like 6 years, and so I am in this hole right now emotionally, where there's pretty much never a good day. There's better days than others when I'm home, because I have to 24/7, take care of someone who is in great pain. And there's nothing worse. I mean, and this isn't heroic, it's actually selfish. I would take that pain for myself 100 times over and let her take care of me. Like, it's emotionally exhausting, to watch someone else suffer where literally you cannot do anything about it. And that's been so some of, I think, what's going on with me right now even is just that's hard. The one thing you said a moment ago that's so important to me is I look at it serves me so well to, like, cut my chest open right down the middle and dump all my stuff out, whether it's on stage or in the book. And I'm not doing it for anything other than I actually just need to. Like, I want to. The only thing that we all as human beings have in common, in my opinion, Gabor Mate might disagree, is struggle. I mean, life is a struggle. I don't care what kind of happy, slant you want to put on it. In some ways, it's not all struggle, but in general, like even at this conference, we get the chance to have we have a high moment for a couple of days. Like you, I've been to a lot of conferences. And usually when the conference is over and you've been home like a day, it's like this air out of the balloon. And it's like, I don't even know what to do with the 100 business cards I just collected, because some of these people I'd really like to be in touch with, but I don't even know where to start. And so life is kind of overwhelming. So I feel like my job, in a sense, is to tell some of the hardest truths about myself openly in public to other people, and trust that I've delivered it in a way where, if some will judge me, some might, but most don't. And even the ones that, it's worth it to get, 20 hugs when I'm done with a talk, or to get emails from people who are struggling with recovery. And if there's 1,000 people here and 10 of them write me and say that I impacted them in helping them make a decision to change their life, that's well worth it.
Oh, yeah. For sure. If people can see even just an iota of their own story in yours, right? And story is so powerful there, right?
I'm going to interrupt you because you hit on something. I so love this. I love it because When I wrote my book, the first draft was basically unreadable. The core of it is exactly what you read, but I had a really bad habit of almost no matter what I said, I would draw a conclusion for the reader. Right? I would say, like if it was something that happened to me, it's like, how could this happen? This kind of thing shouldn't happen. So my editor was brilliant and kind and very gently led me to understand that when you tell stories, if you haven't told a good enough story that your listener or reader doesn't understand what you meant, even if they don't agree with it, if they don't understand that and you have to then explain it, then you haven't done a good job telling the story.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny. I have the same proclivity. We want to tell and not always just show. But showing can be more powerful because it allows the reader to come to their own epiphany, to come to their own conclusion and say, aha.
It's attraction rather than promotion, which is I use the saying all the time in my talks, and I just simply mean it's one of the oldest, like, just rules almost of addiction recovery. If you want to help other people change their lives and get sober if that's needed, first of all, it's none of my business what somebody else does, but the way to do it is to show them an example of what a sober life looks like. It may not be the one they want to lead. It might be the one they want to lead. But the second you cross that line and say to another person, hey, man, seems like you're really drinking too much. Why don't you come to a meeting with... I'm not saying you can't ever say that to someone, but generally speaking, I have had almost zero... I'm a very persuasive person. I've had almost zero success, if you will, in my sober life of ever convincing anyone else to make a decision. They have to convince themselves. Once they do that, then the questions begin, and I can begin to tell them what I think. But up until that time, it's not going to work. And the same is with running. I mean, in general, people watch somebody else run or they see them run a marathon. I mean, more people start to run marathons because they've gone to a marathon and watched other people and they feel that emotion and they want some of that.
Yeah.
But until you want some of that, it's not going to work out.
Yeah. No, it's funny. So I lived in Brooklyn for a very, very long time, and I lived on the route of the New York Marathon. And every year, early November, late October, we would all congregate at our apartment, and we were on the first floor, so we would go right out our door, and we would all set up along the sidewalk, and we'd watch everyone come by, and it was so exhilarating. And then for the next 3 weeks, I would be out there every day, like, I'm going to do this, yes, because it is that it was viral, in terms of that experience. And yeah, I can totally...
Well, the payoff, you get to see the payoff.
Yeah.
And it is one of those, classic, journey moments. It's, you get a chance to watch other runners have, kind of the payoff. But honestly, the payoff is in the preparation for it and the struggles and the not wanting to get up at 5 a.m. if that's your life because you have a job to go to at 7 and you got to get on the train. And, it takes commitment to do those things. And when I tell people all the time that it's far and away the most satisfying thing is to just simply push the enter button on something that you've decided to do and get busy doing it. And stop having that, mental paralysis that stops us from even taking the first step.
Exactly. Well, we're often so focused on product in life that we don't invest in process. And
beautiful.
And once you actually invest in process, you actually learn that the process is the product. It's right. Everything that I've ever done, when I lose myself in the process, that's the payoff.
Yeah. And people get so attached, and me in the past too, you get so attached to drawing a conclusion with due respect to the gurus out there who want you to visualize what your life will look like 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, in a broad sense, I can understand some of that visualization. But what I can tell you from practical experience is you can only do what's right in front of you. And like, if you're not doing that, you don't get to do the next thing.
Yeah, well, we could have a very long conversation about determinism versus free will, but what I believe is that the window for free will is just barely cracked.
Yeah.
And what we do seem to have some control over is where we can focus our attention moment to moment. And we can do so such that we create the chains of events that can be adaptive in the future. One thing that you wrote about crack was that crack brought you into the now. And when I read that, I was like, that's mystical. I mean, that is a mystical experience. This is essentially why I wake up with my mala beads and meditate every day, because I am trying to escape this constant penchant that I have for fixating on the trauma of the past and projecting it into the future as some sort of anticipated negative memory. And I was like, whoa, crack was a maladaptive decision, but on some level, it's representative of a yearning for something mystical, which is like...
And something mystical now, as you said, not something you have to, I mean, I didn't have to work for it. I mean, exactly. Yeah. I did it. I took the rock, I put it in the pipe, I lit it, I smoked it. And for the next 5 to 10 minutes, I was as fully present. I was brilliant. I was funny. Like, everything was just, perfect for those few minutes. And then, of course, there's not even an opposite to that, because what happens next is so much worse than just the opposite of brilliant. It was genuinely, terrible, which is why, the drug keeps telling you to, do it. Not one, and I mean this in all sincerity, not one time ever did I have a binge that involved cocaine or crack that I didn't spend every dime I had or stay out as long as I possibly could, or there was never, not once, because it was impossible for me to stop. And there would always, in every binge, come an intersection between my ability to get more and the amount of catastrophes I'd caused in my life, and like I would finally have to go back into reality. But it was that is the power of that drug, and that's the feeling of it. It's like nothing else.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure moderation was in the Charlie Engle dictionary. Although I do actually have a question that I'll save about it, as in terms of if you have found a level of moderation in your current life. But let's put that on hold just for a second. I mean, the book has many super colorful depictions of your misadventures, and it's great storytelling. And I encourage everyone to read it. But then you did find your way out, and obviously running was a massive component of that. So can you spend a little time talking about that inflection point of coming out, and then how running helped propel you into the next phase of your life?
Yeah, and I want to say too, for any of those folks out there who end up buying the book, weirdly, maybe because I'm a runner, I've sold way more Audible books than I have print copies.
I think I know why.
Yeah. I mean, why?
Because it's your voice.
Yeah, I read it, and I did have to audition to get the job. I'm serious.
Did you really?
Yeah. I was in Poland. There's another story, but I was literally I was in Poland at a wedding, and my agent called and said, "Hey, look, you've been offered the opportunity to read, your audiobook, but they want to hear you read." And it made sense that, just because you can write a book doesn't necessarily mean that anybody wants to hear you actually read it.
Yeah.
Look, the running piece, the question was about running. It was about...
Yeah, just this inflection point.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, what I found in running was actually the same release that I found in a lot of drugs. I mean, not in that instantaneous flash. But what I learned very early is that the more often I put myself actually in a position of distress, which just sounds weird to a lot of people, but like the more often I did that and reached that point where I was certain I couldn't go on, and I mean whether it was a marathon, 100-miler, whatever it was, in all of those events, I would always reach a point where I was certain I couldn't go on.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens. Like if you're going after it, and when I craved reaching that point, I needed to reach that pain threshold and then find a way to move beyond it. And here's the trick, and you said it actually just a moment ago, we project how we feel in any given moment into the future, into the infinite futures. Mm-hmm. So whether it's you just had an argument, as we've all had, a terrible argument with your significant other, where you've said things that you didn't want to say, and you heard things you want to, like one of those really bad ones. Well, you project that. It feels in that moment like it's always going to feel that way. You can't actually imagine in that moment that it's never not going to suck in this relationship. Well, that's what running allowed me to do over and over and over. I could get to that place where I was certain I couldn't go on. Then I would find a way to get beyond it. And that taught me that more than anything else, never make big decisions at a super low moment.
Yeah.
Because you're going to quit. I mean, you're going to leave the relationship. You're going to quit the run. You're going to quit the job. You're not, but experience told me that if I just let that moment pass and I did the things that I knew how to do, that my pain in a run might go from a 10 to an 8, but that's a huge difference, when you're really struggling. So I don't know if that answer made sense. But
well, yeah, it also makes me think about that point where you think you cannot go on. Well, first of all, I agree with you. I think we tend to think that rock bottom is a free fall. It's going to go forever, right? But it doesn't. The sun rises. But it also makes me think about, my 3 girls were all born at home. And we had professional help, but I was a quasi doula for all of them. And one phenomena that shared across all my 3 daughters' births are my wife. We were doing it at home, obviously, so there was no Pitocin and there's no induction or anything like that. And she would get to a point, and the labors weren't easy, and she would get to the point where she would say, "I can't do this. I can't go on anymore. I just can't go on." And the midwife would look at me, and we'd be like, "Here comes the baby." And it is funny, or just that life often works that way. That this time where we think that is it is a gateway to the other side. So one thing that I just want to remark before we get into some of the more amazing ultra endurance achievements that will boggle everyone's mind, is that even while you were an addict, you still seem to have an extraordinary physical capacity. Like, you're telling stories where you're literally up all night long and then getting to a race and somehow completing marathons and more. I mean, what do you attribute that? I mean, that's
I don't recommend that.
No, yeah.
But yes,
I think there's a story in Monterey in particular.
At
like,
Big Sur,
what?
I literally had to I drank 2 beers that I took from spectators in the last 5 miles of the race, just so I could get through it, and I still ran a pretty,
Yeah, I
pretty
think
fast
connected
time,
to that,
so.
I don't want to interrupt you, but you had a line. I don't think I wrote it. It was like, the art of the strategic vomit.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Right.
I was like,
Well, because if you throw up at just the right time, it really is a relief.
Yeah.
And oh man. So yeah, that was, I do think I have a physical capacity that some of it's genetic. And I mean, again, then I can point you to, 10 other athletes out there or 100 that I admire and watch sometimes. And now the science of it is actually really coming around. I mean, here we are at a biohacking conference, and it is a fact. You can see in someone's genetics, like I do have the endurance gene. There is such a thing, right? So I don't think the gene says how much endurance I have. I think it just identifies that it is there. It would be like having the gene for, Alzheimer's or anything else. Like
right. It needs to be expressed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I found, for whatever reason, I just understood that it's a combination of, I was going to say this physically, but I will say this. We can't underestimate the power of the addict brain because addiction is its obsession in a different form. And you cannot there's a lot of successful people here at this conference now. You're a successful person. You can't be successful at anything, I would argue, without at least periods of great obsession, where whatever that thing is, you're thinking about it when your head hits the pillow, and it's the first thing that pops in your head the next day when you wake up, and like you're obsessed with it. It could be a person, it could be a job, it could be a run, it could be anything, but like that's important.
Yeah, I think the way you describe it in the book is a spiritual connection to something that you love.
Yeah, that's it. And that is it. Like that, it's just what you want to be doing. It may or may not be the best thing for you, but that's kind of irrelevant. And I mean, I think we lose sight. I lose sight as a parent. Even it's been very hard for me to basically butt out of my kids' lives. I mean, we're very close. I am with my boys, and we love each other, and we still, they hug and kiss me in public, and I mean, we have a great relationship, but I've had to be, because I grew up with a father who was the opposite. He was the incredibly critical human. He just was that guy who found fault in everything. And I do know that that's where a ton of my my wounds, originate. But I didn't want to, I didn't and don't want to do that, for my own kids. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's a gene. That endurance gene is in me. It makes me want to see how far I can go. Mm-hmm. But as we get into these stories, I mean, one of the things that you'll, probably point out, and if you don't, I will, is it's not running. I always make the joke. It's not running I like. It's stopping. Because there is. I'm not stupid. I mean, there is a great relief and beautiful feeling when you're doing something really hard, and then you stop doing it. Like that is actually a payoff thing. It feels amazing to do that.
Yeah. So I know this guy Wim Hof. You know him?
Indeed.
Yeah, the Iceman. Yeah. He tells me one day, he's like, I hate the ice, but I love getting out of the ice and being warm.
I'm so happy to hear that, Wim. And I've met him a few times, and I've done, a couple of his courses, and he helped me without knowing it. Last year, I got quite serious about breath work, and that's sort of where I started, and then evolved into some other places. But yeah, he's got a, he's a character, but he's got a great perspective. Like he's a guy though that he will be the one to tell you that genetically he is actually built a little differently, and that there are some it's not that we as mere mortals can't achieve some of what he achieves. That's the point of kind of what he teaches.
Right.
But I'm not sure that he actually would say that you can do exactly what I do.
Although it's interesting because he has a twin brother.
Ah,
and
I did not know that.
Yeah, and so he actually he has a control experiment there with his brother. I'm not sure if they're identical or
interesting.
Or not. So,
yeah.
anyways, we can probe that. With
Yeah,
him
yeah,
at some
yeah.
point.
Of course, yeah.
It would be too simple to say that the addiction to running just replaced the addiction to alcohol and drugs. The way that you put it, I think, which was beautiful. Again, drugs were my way out. Running was my way through. So take us to that time, in your life where you were basically just running became that focus. And maybe you can tell us about some of the more unbelievable things that you decided to take on.
Yeah, and it did happen a bit by accident, which is a weird thing to say, but maybe that's the way a lot of the best things happen. I really just made a decision, the day I got sober, crazy, incident with police and bullets and, crack and just like this awful situation. And I went to a 12-step recovery meeting that night, and then I got up the next day and I went for a run. And I very quickly, just like that day, committed that I would do that for 30 days. I just, it felt like a sensible commitment to make. It might even have been a suggestion from my sponsor. And, so I ran every day, whatever that meant, and I went to a meeting every single day for 30 days. And my life got tremendously better because it was really, it was pretty bad. So getting better didn't take, that wasn't that hard, but... Yeah. And then I committed to 90 days, and before I knew it, honestly, it evolved into 3 straight years of not missing a single day of running, or of going to a meeting, right. And I slowly began to build a life for myself. And it's interesting how complicated I think almost all of our lives feel, with our phones and I'm as guilty as anybody, and there's almost never a quiet moment. We have to manufacture a quiet moment. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was so singularly focused on just accomplishing those 2 things every day that it actually allowed me this beautiful break in my life. Mm-hmm. And running was a huge part of it. Now, I will also, I want to let you get in here, but I want to preemptively say there was some punishment built up in there too. There was self-flagellation happening at the same time. Yeah. I could, because I still felt like shit about myself. I still didn't feel like I was worthy of love or that I was a good person, and I'd caused so much wreckage and this and that running is a really easy way. You can go out and in pretty short order make yourself hurt. I don't know of any other sport that you can actually get yourself to that pain point more quickly.
So it's a form of penance almost.
100%. It allowed me to sort of, I don't know that I knew it at the time. I don't want to pretend like I was that enlightened at that point, but I knew that I felt like I needed to suffer. And then the suffering gave me great benefit otherwise. It gave me confidence. And look, I still didn't know who I was at that point. And I was running like a marathon every month. And so you got to think about this. This is 30 years ago. Now it's like, your grandmother's done Boston 5 times. But 30 years ago, when you were a marathon runner, people would give you, you got that, wow, I can't believe you do that. And I freely admit, I'm sure it was part ego. Like I needed that positive reinforcement at that time. And I also needed to feel that I was different than you, or than other people. Like I don't know where that need came from, but I didn't want to be normal. I wanted to be different. And so that nurtured that.
Yeah. The self-infliction of pain is just kind of a fascinating topic in and of itself. I mean, it's baked into all these religious traditions, right, too. It's like I've seen these rites in Mexico where these women will walk on their knees, on harsh surface, all the way, up to the cross, miles, and they're all bleeding and scarred up and all these things. Now, obviously, religion has its own.
That's a different sacrifice, but yeah.
But we do gravitate to this notion of pain, almost like we need the pain to know that we're alive, and it's so curious.
Well, I don't think it's actually even more complicated than the lesson of when you earn something and you feel like you've earned it, whether it's $1 or a date with somebody you want, like when you sort of earned it, and rather than it just simply being handed to you. Of course, there's satisfaction, and it was, for me, it was again this process of learning how to deal with discomfort, how to push through it, and how to kind of, I think it's an adaptability thing. The more often I did it, I had every problem you could ever imagine running marathons. Blisters and cramps and hurt joints and dehydration or whatever it was. And pretty much every time I found a way to get through. And so it would be kind of like, oh, okay, I can do that.
Yeah. Okay, so you ran 4,500 miles across the Sahara. And then this was captured in a documentary that was narrated by Matt Damon. What was the genesis of this idea? And give us a little window into what that experience was like.
Yeah, man, that was, it is the sort of the linchpin in my life in a lot of ways, that, that run. And it came from, my life had gotten better. I was 10 or 12 years clean and sober at that point. I was a senior producer for ABC's Extreme Makeover Home Edition at that point, which was a cool job, and I liked doing it. And I was doing these really hard races around the world, all over the world. I was winning some of them, and this race I went to in the Amazon jungle was it was like Tour de France style. It was a running race, but it was 7 days, and you do a certain distance every day, and the winner is determined by cumulative time. Yeah. So you're running like a marathon a day for 7 days, but it's across the Amazon jungle, and it was brutal and awful. And
like the jungle floor.
Totally. This was the heart of the Amazon jungle, with every insect, bee, wasp, snake, spider. And it's 100 degrees plus humidity, and it was a very, very, very hard event. And
how many participants would an event have?
Couple hundred, and about half of them were Brazilian, and the other half were from all over the world in that race. It was a big race, and I actually did end up winning that race. But the funny thing is, it's like the only reason I won is because the Brazilian runners who were far more talented, just didn't, and they were much better in the jungle than I was. They lived there. They just didn't have the training and nutrition and so forth. So I had more experience, but that's another story. But during that event, this guy, Ray, who was Canadian, I'd seen him once before at a race. We're in jungle hammocks at the end of one of the stages, and because you couldn't sleep on the ground, that was not happening. And he literally blurts out this idea. He's like, "Hey, I just came back from Niger. I did a race in Niger not long ago, and he's like, I don't think anybody's ever run across the Sahara Desert. Is that something you'd ever think about doing?" And I basically, I told him that was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard, and you'd have to be an idiot to even think about it. And so of course I couldn't stop thinking about it because I'm an idiot. And I get back home and I'd start doing research, because I actually, this is, I think though, me listening to the universe in a way. I'm not to be overly woo-woo here, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I took that as a sign. So I researched, and no one had ever run all the way across the Sahara. And I literally just started telling people that I was going to be the first person to run across the Sahara. And, you ever think about starting a business or you're going to do a thing or whatever, and it's really, really like 1 in a million that you're going to do it. So it's sort of easy to say you're going to do it because the reality of it actually happening, you don't feel like it's going to go that far. And so the fact that it did actually happen was baffling. But I got to meet this thanks to a connection at Extreme Makeover Home Edition. I met this director, James Mall. And James had won the Academy Award for Best Documentary 2 years earlier for a film called The Last Days, about the final days of a group of Hungarian Jews in concentration camps in World War II. And fascinating. I mean, couldn't have been a further distance away from the kind of project running the Sahara was going to be, except for maybe the suffering part. But I went in to see him, and I got a meeting. I showed up late. Showed up like 20 minutes late for a 30-minute meeting. Gave literally the worst pitch of my life. Tuaregs, my Everest, like nobody's ever done it. It's the Sahara sand. And it was horrible. And, and he literally stood up at the end of the meeting and stuck out his hand. He's like, I'll do it. And a week later he calls and he's just hung up with Matt Damon, and he wants to executive produce and narrate the film. And ultimately Hans Zimmer comes on to do the score. I mean, that's later down the road, so I didn't know he was going to be involved. But I've got these Academy Award winners involved in this project, and I am terrified.
Well, you got to deliver now, right?
I'm the biggest pretender there is. Like, I mean, we talk about whatever it is, pretender complex or whatever it's called.
Yeah,
imposter complex, thank you. And I felt like, well, here's the thing. Addicts, if you've known some, we are the best salespeople on the planet because we spent years and years telling people, I will never do that again, and getting them to believe us. There's a sincerity that an addict is able to muster, I think, that isn't something everyone can do. And I had convinced this is how I felt. I had convinced all of these people that this was a great idea, and like we were going to go out to the Sahara and we were all going to die. I mean, that is quite literally how I felt. And it took a year and a half to put it together. It got postponed twice. We lost one investor, and like Matt Damon and this production company are putting all this together. But the pressure on me it's outrageous. Because, it's not a money-making venture. I think I got paid, I have no idea, $30,000 or something for, like, the entire project. I had no ownership in it. But I did understand that it could be a launching pad for speaking and for other things. And do you know what, though? I make it sound like I had a plan. I didn't have a plan. I wanted one thing. I wanted to see if I could do it.
Yeah.
I wanted to see if I could run across the entire Sahara Desert. And that was at the core, there was nothing more to it. We started this big nonprofit and other cool things happened. But at its real core, it was just about seeing whether or not I could do it, which is, I think, how any big adventure should be. People come to me all the time and they're like, oh, I'm running this marathon. And it's almost like they're embarrassed. And they'll say, I'm raising money for Alzheimer's, or I'm doing this for breast cancer. And I'm like, man, that's cool. It's great. But the number one person you need to be doing it for is for you. Because you're trying to make yourself grow so that you can be useful to other people.
So you went out there to prove it to yourself.
100%. And I was still at a point, even at that point of my sobriety, where I was still proving to myself. My dad hated the idea and told me I was, wasting my time, and, and just all the things that, those of us who've lived that kind of existence know. And that just lit a fire under me more than anything else. And I just wanted to, I will tell you, I knew right from the start, who the hell wants to watch? I ended up with two co-runners, one of them being the guy who ultimately, who's the one who suggested the bad idea to begin with, so I made him go with me. But, it really was just this test to see whether or not it was possible, but there was no doubt there was a part of me wanting to prove something still at that point, because I still didn't, I don't know that I do now, but I still didn't know kind of who I was, and I was still in the midst of creating an identity. But I should say this one thing. Here's what I knew. I actually didn't care about the running. What I cared about was cultural exploration. I mean, and I meant that then, and I mean it now. Yeah. I'm way more interested in going places and interacting with people than I am about running as fast as I can through their country.
And you did that.
And I did that. When we interacted, I mean, I crossed 6, predominantly Muslim countries with, a crew that was entirely Muslim, across countries like Niger and Libya and Egypt. And it was such a beautiful, eye-opening experience.
Yeah.
And I wasn't surprised about it. It was eye-opening, but it was what I expected. Because I knew that while I hadn't had a lot of up-close personal time with people who practice Islam, I also knew that they're just people. And once we got out into the desert, I developed loving friendships with, these guys that will last for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Well, and not only was it physically taxing beyond anyone's wildest imagination, it wasn't particularly safe.
It wasn't. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't tell everybody that as we went in, and
look, man, that's great.
The first week was, I'm sorry, way longer than that. The first month and a half was about 140-degree ground temperatures. So we had environmental issues. We ran out of food and water, and then we also, of course, had people issues.
Yeah.
So I mean, in the middle of the desert, it's pretty distressing to see a pickup truck coming at you from a great distance, and you can tell there's a bunch of people piled in the back of it, and they get to you, and they're all carrying automatic weapons, and nobody, neither myself nor my 2 teammates spoke Arabic, so Ray spoke French. So in parts of West Africa, we were still okay. But once we got into the central part of the desert and certainly into Libya and Egypt, like, we were on our own. I mean, we had a crew, but I mean, the crew wasn't like following behind us. They'd go 5 or 10 kilometers up ahead, and it'd be like being in the ocean. If your rescue boat is 10 kilometers ahead, I mean, it might as well be 1,000 miles. Like, there's no way. They can't see you. There's no way you're going to communicate. So there were some scary moments.
Yeah. Okay, but you did it, and it was received extremely well, and you're kind of off onto this next chapter of your life. But somehow the trials and tribulations of Charlie Engle doesn't quite stop there. So you become targeted by an overzealous, is it IRS or IRS
it was, yeah.
agent who concocts some crazy gambit to go after you for mortgage fraud. And, we don't have to spend a tremendous amount of time getting into the absurdity of this quest, but and you're more than welcome to color it as you like, but the outcome is that you actually have to go to prison for 18 months, was it?
Indeed.
And you're going to a prison in Beckley, West Virginia.
Yes.
Now it's not a maximum security prison.
Mm-hmm.
So you have some freedoms. Give us a little window into that chapter. That was an unexpected chapter.
Yeah, who knew? And look, for those people who want to delve deeper into the story of how that came to be, it's well covered in the book. It's on my website. It was on the front page of the New York Times a couple of times, which is not what I had hoped for under the circumstances. But, in short, I became the only person in the U.S. At that time to be charged with overstating my income on a home loan application. I mean, put it simply. And for that, I could be sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Weirdly, I'm actually found not guilty of providing false information on a loan application, but guilty of mail fraud, because I did, in fact, sign a closing package that included false information. And whether I knew it was there, is irrelevant. And, by a technicality, really the jury had no choice but to find me guilty of that. So I found myself on Valentine's Day in 2011 being dropped off at the front gate of prison, the world's worst summer camp, by my kids, who are driving dad.
You called it your federal holiday.
Yeah, my federal. That's it. I still call it that today, my federal holiday. And look, and again, it was a terrible experience at first. And that sounds strange because I'm implying that it became less terrible, but it did. And there was a level of acceptance that happened, which part of it came about because of perspective. The perspective I got, because look at what had been done to me. I'm pounding my chest and talking about unfairness, and I'm in a prison with 500 men, most of whom were black, most of whom were nonviolent drug offenders, who got 20 or 30-year sentences for minor. It might have been their third strike after 2 shoplifting charges, and they lost their entire life to that. And so, I got a chance to understand that that 18-month period was going to be completely up to me as to whether my happiness was up to me still, no matter where I was. I had an opportunity. I'll keep this super short, but basically I started running every day the same way I always do. It's what I knew how to do. I would run in my cell sometimes for hours at a time in place, and people thought I was nuts, which in federal prison isn't a bad thing for the middle-aged white guy to be considered nuts. Yeah. People sort of left me alone. But, eventually, and I mentioned it earlier in our talk, attraction rather than promotion. I never one time reached out to someone else in the prison and said, because this would be a bad idea, hey, dude, you look like you could lose a few pounds, or maybe you want to exercise. Why don't you come run with me? Instead, I did my thing, and people actually made fun of me. It's where I got my name, the Running Man. That's right. And slowly but surely, guys started coming up to me and saying, hey, can you, would you mind teaching me how to run? I mean, that's basically the best way to put it. Because a lot of these folks, they've been in impoverished situations. They had tough lives compared to mine. And, by the time I left there a year and a half later, I had a running group of 50 guys running with me pretty much every day. And like a dozen of them lost more than 100 pounds. And I got guys doing yoga with me on the softball field. And like it was as I like to say, my very first sponsor, John, all the way back in 1992, taught me this one simple phrase of, to keep it, you have to give it away. And it's a very simple thing that I think applies to almost anything. If you have a gift, if you have something that you can give to others freely without expectation of a return, an ROI, and you're not giving it to them, why do you have it? Like why have you gained this skill, whether it's art or writing or music or running or whatever it might be, if you're not going to share it with other people, or if you're only doing it, to get paid? Like it's a pretty unsatisfying thing. And I got a chance to change a few lives, but ultimately I was doing it for myself.
Yeah. Well, isn't that often the case, is that giving is self-care?
100%. It's so beautifully and simply said, because that is, none of us feels better than when we help somebody else feel better.
Yeah.
It's a great, great feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. You were also leading recovery workshops, right, within the prison, which I can't remember if this was in your book. I heard you talk about this with Rich Roll, where most of these guys, or a big chunk of these guys, are in prison for drug-related charges, but there is no recovery services or addiction recovery services offered. I mean, how ridiculous is that?
No, there's your tax dollars at work right there. So in the federal system, there is no drug treatment.
Yeah.
If you got a 20-year sentence, you would get the opportunity at about 18 years to take a drug education course. Let me sum that up for you. The drug education course goes like this. You're a burden to society. You suck. Don't do drugs. Like, and I'm not kidding. Like that, it takes 6 months to teach that course, but that's what it amounted to. But it would get guys a few extra months off of their sentence at the end, so everybody would take the. So it checks the box of they got some help. But you know, come on, it's just crazy. And I say all the time, who would you rather have as your neighbor? You know, the guy who got help while he was in there, who got some therapy, who maybe took some college classes, might have even gotten a degree. While you might feel like, well, my tax dollars shouldn't be paid for somebody else's degree, which person would you rather have as your neighbor when he gets out?
Yeah.
The guy who actually applied himself and got a degree, or he's so pissed off, he's getting back out and he's just going to, you know, commit some other crime, you know, probably just to go back in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, you know, when you write a book, before it's deployed out into the world, it's all just yours. But once it's out there, it's a million different books because everybody has their own, they're bringing their own experience to it. So when I was reading this piece about your experience in prison, how deeply unfair that was, but then how you turned that opportunity into helping people. I came back to this Viktor Frankl quote, and I had to look it up because I was like, there's a feeling welling up inside of me that I have to codify in some way. So I found it. It said, the one thing you can't take away from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of one's freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given circumstance.
Hell yeah. I mean, that is, I know that quote, and I always laugh because it tells you the kind of friends I actually had when I went to prison. About 10 different people sent me that book. The book. No, the book. I mean, like everybody wanted to send me that book.
Yeah.
And you know, and it's beautiful, and it is like we have a choice in any situation. I'm not saying you're going to be happy if something terrible is happening in your life right away, but you do have an opportunity to find happiness and joy. And when I flipped that whole experience on its head, I spent 1.5 years reading books, writing my own book, helping other people, having no bills to pay, taking naps in the afternoon. Like it was you know, not a holiday I would have chosen for myself because my family, my kids were suffering during this time. But I couldn't, once I gained some acceptance of that, it actually really allowed me to take advantage of all that it had to offer. You know, I just, I let it flow and it changed. I mean, this sounds crazy in some way. I would not change even that part of all that has happened. You know, I missed my mom had Alzheimer's, and I literally missed the last probably couple of years of her good cognitive, you know, life. Like by the time I got out, she was mostly gone. And so that one hurts a lot, you know, but what I took away from the experience was a knowledge also of, I had a conversation just recently. Somebody said to me, you know, the addiction recovery, you know, business it just doesn't work. It's not working. I'm like, oh no, it works. It works. There's hundreds of billions of dollars changing hands, and the system keeps hospitals and jails and prisons full, and rehabs and sober living houses, and it doesn't matter, despite the fact that probably less than 10% of people who go to rehab, manage to stay sober for a year. This churning machine that has lobbyists and pays politicians and everything else. It's working. It's working exactly how it's designed to work right now. And so I actually needed to have the prison experience and understand, because those people, I'm doing air quotes again, those people in prison, before I went to prison were just those people. I'm like, I don't have anything in common with them, and I am them. Like, and it really.
Then of course the irony was that you got into so much trouble early on in your life, with no punitive.
Yeah. I ask audiences though, and I get provocative on stage sometimes. I will ask an audience. I should have done it today for this audience, but I'll ask an audience. As I said, I drove around the biggest cities in this country for 10 years buying crack from strangers on the street. Do you know how many times I got pulled over by the police? Zero. Do you want to know why? And someone will say, because you're white. And I mean, the reality is I was a generally clean-cut guy, white guy driving a Toyota 4Runner, not fancy, not a piece of crap, just a regular car. And, and in general, just nothing ever happened to me. Yet, had I been stopped with, 10 rocks of crack in my pocket, by the cops, probably wasted while I'm driving around, if I had been stopped, that by the law probably could have been 25 years for me, as it was for some of the people I was locked up with. So I don't look at it as karma, because I wasn't I don't accept, like, I was the person I harmed absolutely the most as an addict was me. I certainly did some damage in my family, but I didn't hurt people physically. I didn't steal from people. I spent my own family's money, and I certainly did plenty of damage, but I don't think it was a karmic thing, but I just think it was maybe the universe saying, hey, you got some more lessons to learn, man.
Yeah. Running is so rife with metaphor. And it's almost too easy, for me to ask you, like, Charlie, what are you running from, man? You running from yourself? But there's this one quote, and I've kind of actually altered it a little bit for my own purposes, but it goes something like this: all desire is the inappropriate substitute to be at peace with oneself. And so I guess I would ask you, are you at peace with yourself, or is there still something that you're running from?
I'm not at peace. But I'm the difference in me today and me, years ago when I also wasn't at peace is I didn't know it then.
You have more awareness, self-awareness.
Right. Yeah. I actually think for many, many years, like I thought, I felt like I was at peace. I didn't feel like it, maybe I should say. I thought I was at peace because I had checked a lot of boxes. I was accomplishing these things. I'd built a life. I'd raised kids. I had a family. And so that part of it felt like, it felt satisfying. And weirdly, as we sit here today, I told you earlier I'll be 60 in a week, and so there is I think there's a thing right now in me that is a little afraid, and I admit that because I try to say real things about how I feel. It's not about afraid of dying or whatever. I'm actually just kind of afraid of running out of time. Like there's a lot of stuff I still want to do. So I feel like that's not a peaceful feeling, and that, and maybe that's not even what you mean, but I mean,
well, you're driven still. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot that you're doing. I mean, you're giving talks, you're at conferences. I know that you have a whole bunch of different relationships with different interesting brands. Yes. I know that you're thinking about, and this kind of, is the next chapter, which I would love to probe a little bit. And my sense is that we'll need to have another conversation about this.
Anytime.
Because it's really about your work in recovery and helping people in their own addiction, with their own addictions.
Things need to change.
Yeah.
We're not doing a good job, and it's not, I'm partners with treatment centers, so I am not calling them out because they are using the tools that they have. But, wearable devices, psychedelics, like all of these things are things that in past years, 10 years ago, I would have thrown somebody out of the room if they were talking to me about that stuff.
Yeah.
Because I would have just said, that's for people who aren't willing to work hard enough and do the hard work and get in there and really dig in. They want a shortcut. They want a hack, right? Because a hack to me, was always, synonymous with shortcuts. So you want to try to get there faster and easier. And I don't think that way today. I do believe that in the treatment business, in things like, I don't advocate for psychedelics everywhere, go to the drugstore and get yours and everything's going to be fine. But therapeutic treatment in that space with long-term treatment afterwards, you have to have, you have to make it part of your life. You might have a particularly powerful experience on that one day where you have the medicine, but then you need 6 months of integration. You need to understand what that meant, and that needs to be done by a professional. So, my mission, if you will, is to destigmatize some of these things and to, try to, like a lot of people, I'm the millionth person probably to say that,
Well, but you're actually coming at it from a different vantage point. It's one thing to say, yeah, we can use psychedelics to address addiction and depression and mental illness, but coming from inside the recovery community, it's way more thorny to say that. So where does the recovery community at large kind of stand on, the use of psychedelics or psilocybin, et cetera, for treatment?
It's a good question because I spend a lot of time hanging out with people who generally are open-minded like I am about it. And I will, I'm even doing it a little bit right now in small little pieces, even right here with you. I'm introducing this idea that this is going to be part of my future. And I am going to, it's not for me to say what might work for someone else. Because basically we're just, people are dying all over the place. And if you don't know what the mental health and addiction crisis is like in this, not just in this country, but around the world right now, then you really aren't somebody that I have anything in common with anyway. So, But I think the recovery world is, open to it. I'm very happy to say that several of the treatment centers I work with, while I thought about naming a couple right now, and I won't do that, I know at their core, there needs to be science, there needs to be a lot of studies, and those studies are happening right now.
Yeah. Unfortunately, they were interrupted for 40 years.
Yeah.
Because there was some decent clinical research going on in the 50s and 60s. And I know we're both...
Well, in 1985, MDMA was still legal.
Yeah. Well, then it got rebranded as ecstasy and put in the rave.
It escaped the lab, as they say, and it became a party drug. And because of that, it, in the infinite wisdom of the governing bodies, they just made it, unavailable for anybody. And that's, it's too bad that happened. But I think we're getting closer to that not being the case. And yeah, from inside, I know what's coming. Look, everybody would prefer to be liked than have darts thrown at them. But I know there will be a certain subset of the addiction community that's going to, call me out or whatever. And those are people who aren't listening to what I'm saying. They're only hearing what they want to hear. They're hearing the word psychedelic and they're making they're making a snap judgment about what that means and, and whatever. But the fact of the matter is, I've buried couple dozen people in the last just couple of years from fentanyl overdoses, and these are people who weren't doing fentanyl.
No,
they're doing cocaine, or they're doing heroin, or they're doing a drug that, and I'm not advocating, but they're doing a drug that they knew how to do, and all of a sudden, their supplier puts fentanyl in it, or however that happens, and they die.
Yeah.
And
my daughter is 15. She just lost a friend.
Yeah.
Here in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Don't think that it can't impact you.
No, it's rampant, and it's it's not going to change anytime soon. We're not going to stop that drug. Yeah. There is no amount of, some people will say, well, put your money and effort into legislation that will, what are you going to do? Make it more illegal? I mean, it's in the amount of fentanyl that can come in the size of a Coke can could kill everybody at this conference. And I mean, whereas that's not the case. If it were cocaine or if it were a lot of other drugs, it could hurt people. It could do a lot of things, but in all likelihood, it wouldn't kill a bunch of people. It's just so we have to change the stigma and the attitude, and we got to figure out how to. I really believe that I talked about it on stage some today a little bit, but wearable devices. Because if I can see, nobody relapses in a moment, and this is an important. I know we probably need to wrap this up, but there's an important point here. Nobody that's in early recovery or at any point in their recovery has the thought, I want a drink, and then they pick up a drink and they drink it. They have the thought because it's triggered by something they saw on television, or they went with friends to a restaurant, or they had an argument with their wife. Like whatever that trigger was, that addict in their brain said, hey, a drink would really help this, right? And it's like, hey. and it starts to get on the treadmill in there, and it starts running around, and meanwhile other people are asking this person, hey, how's it going? Oh man, things are good, everything's great, but that wheel's still spinning. And so with wearable devices, it is my firm belief, and science and studies that we're doing is starting to prove this out, that the treadmill is causing disrupted sleep. It's causing other stress markers that we can see and track, and a lot of them are algorithmic. But algorithms are good for that. It's a good predictor of future behavior. So I can see it coming, and if I can see it coming, then I have a chance to do what I call, and I don't know if I've coined this phrase, but I should, and I use it all the time. I call it a soft intervention. I'm just doing a soft intervention. I'm reaching out to that person with a text and saying, hey, I see, you had been sleeping great. Here's a meditation that you could try tonight, or here's something that you could try to do. And just that contact with that person can be enough to right the ship.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So what it could literally look like is a wearable that can measure some sort of biomarker or metric that could then trigger a signal, because it's hooked up to the internet, to some sort of general dashboard where there is someone trained who could be essentially a soft sponsor that could then essentially make that soft intervention. And that technology is completely at our disposal, right?
It's here right now. Yeah, it's all over the place. And it's a matter of building the system and getting the buy-in. And I'll have people that will say to me, well, look, the addict's just going to take it off. Like if he's going to go drink or whatever. And I remind people that no data is data also.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? If I see that somebody took their
right.
Well, they
have
wearable
ankle,
off. A monitor,
monitors, right? So yeah.
Well, if they took it off and I see no signal or there's nothing happening for 2 days, then I'm also going to call them.
Right.
And you know what? Right now, the bar is set so low on the number of people that actually achieve, a year of recovery. I do want to point out one funny thing. It's not funny. It's the wrong word completely. I saw a paper recently, an article really, that makes a claim that up to 75% of people eventually get sober. So the implication being that if you just leave people to their own devices, that eventually they will stop drinking or they'll stop drugging. They'll just sort of age out of it somehow. While I don't really believe that, the point is so missed. Drinking And the drug use is a symptom of the problem. It's not the problem. So you can quit drinking, you can quit drugging, and most of us have known somebody who, quit quote unquote cold turkey. And generally speaking, that person is making maybe other people in their life less miserable, but they're probably just as miserable as they ever were. They're just not drinking.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question here is, an alternate title for your book could have been Extreme. As I mentioned earlier, moderation was, though you sought it in many cases, it was not something that came easy. And so here we are at the biohacking conference. So much of biohacking is focused on longevity. Now, I interview tons of doctors, and one of the principal keys to longevity in one's own physiology is the Goldilocks zone. It is finding balance between the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system, between the exchange of carbon dioxide and the exchange of oxygen, between glucagon and insulin, between, this neurotransmitter and that neurotransmitter. Essentially, when we find balance in our own physiology, that's when we tend to be healthiest. And so, given that you've lived a life of great extremes, have you found at this juncture in your life some sense of the Goldilocks zone, some sense of moderation?
Yes. I have. Simply put, I'll expand, but I'm still driven, and I still want, but it's almost like what I said before. My drive is much more around, I don't want to be a tourist. Like if I'm going to go to South America and go, spend a month in Peru and Colombia or whatever, I don't want to be in a car or on the back of a tour bus. I want to be on foot or on a bike, or I want to be experiencing it, like that. The difference in who I am today and who I was even, 10 or 15 years ago is I needed that competition. I needed to be testing myself against the environment, against other people. I got pretty good at once the competition was over, I was done with it. I'm not a person that drags that stuff around with me, and I would already be focusing on what's next. But I think I am in that place. I'm going in November to Everspace Camp and participating in an event that's actually I'm helping to produce. It's the world's highest obstacle course race. So we're setting a Guinness record, and there's about 50 people that are going, and we're going to drag all this stuff up there and set up an obstacle course and do. And so what I'm looking for now is more of these sort of peak experiences that involve more other people. And I'm still chasing my lowest to highest adventure, which is this one that I've been talking about for 10 years now, and I'm still pretty determined to do it, which is going from the Dead Sea to the top of Mount Everest. But I think I am in that. I'm generally in that, and some of it I freely admit is I have punished my body. I've got some parts that are wearing out, and they're not really replaceable that in a way that would allow me to do the things that I love to do the way I want to do them, which is actually this biohacking. I attended the stem cell thing yesterday, and I need to understand a lot more, but I am excited about the direction that these things are going, and I do think that there's in the longevity space there's a lot that we're just learning, and I feel good about it. I mean, not that I'm trying to give your audience messages, but I do give those folks in the longevity business a hard time if the first thing that they're saying isn't, number one, move your body. Because if you want a pill or an elixir or a light or a whatever it is to extend your life, and you're not even putting forth the effort to go for a 30-minute walk every day, which will which will 10 times greater give you longevity over anything else you could do in a general sense. There's probably some scientists here that would argue with me on that point, but in my experience, if you just move your body, you're ahead of the game. Now, hey, if I'm moving my body and somebody wants to give me that pill that's going to help me, go run a fast marathon again, I'd be happy to do it.
Well, you're looking pretty ripped, I will say. And
thank you.
And I know that you do some work with a mutual friend, Deepak Chopra, and who recently, I guess, facilitated a reading for you that illustrated that, or that illuminated that your 60th year was going to be big time. Something big was going to happen. And so here we are on the precipice of it. So I hope we can sit here next year and discuss what that was.
I would love it. Yeah, I would love it. I'm ready. I'm ready for that. And I want to keep exploring everything that I can. And Deepak has a way of putting things in perspective. For me, because he the one thing about him is he actually doesn't worry. I don't want to say I'm a worrier, but I mean I do worry. And the thing that I worry about people in my life, I worry about normal things. I don't think I worry overly much, but I try to keep in mind that this is not all in my control, and as long as I just keep doing the thing that's in front of me, I'll get to do the thing that's after that.
Yeah. Well, the dictionary definition of nirvana is blowing out. So he's very good at blowing out, and I think we could all learn that lesson just to exhale.
Yeah.
Charlie Engle, what a delight it is to meet you, to spend time with you, especially in this kind of intimate environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friend. It was great.
Cool. To be continued.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.